Okay.
Okay. OK。皆さん、こんばんは。おはようございます。こんにちは。ユタ大学の英文学部の、准教授でデイビッド・ローと申します。Zoom で早稲田に誘ってくださって、本当にありがとうございます。キム先生にいろいろお世話になっておりますね。今日、私の新しい本を紹介するんですが、始める前に、私は皆さんに謝らなければならないんですね。正直言えば、最近、日本語で喋る機会が全然なかったので、この発表を英語で話します。よろしくお願いします。じゃあ、始めます。So I want to begin by admitting that I'm a bit of an interloper. I came to this work not by any kind of institutional pathway, but kind of by accident. I graduated from college and I taught English in Japan for a year before I entered my PhD program, my doctoral course in English. But while I was in graduate school, I continued to study Japanese. And so I always had this kind of idea of this book in my mind. I'm out of focus for some reason, sorry. Not sure what's happening with my camera. Hopefully that'll come into focus sometime soon. Well, hopefully this comes back. But as I was in graduate school trying to figure out this project, I was a bit frustrated because there was a real lack of institutional engagement in both Asian studies and Asian American studies. Now, that's not to say there's not scholarly work in this area, and that's increasing, but I couldn't find really explicit ties between the two fields. And with the kind of exception of Transpacific studies as an umbrella term, but there was almost this kind of reluctance, even within that field, to kind of openly bridge Asian and Asian American studies. So, my training is in Asian American studies, but my work in Zainichi studies has really just been kind of haphazard, aided by the generosity of friends and colleagues who were willing to share their knowledge with me when I asked, and happy to point out when I was wrong and barking up the wrong tree. I'm going to change my lighting. Hopefully this will change the focus. 1 second, please. Okay, that seems to be better. I think everyone had a chance to read the introduction. Is that right? That was distributed to the readership. I hope. So I won't go too much into the framework of the book because I think that's covered quite at length in the introduction. But what I'm really trying to construct is a framework, which I'm calling Modern Transpacific, that decenters the colonial metropole, right? While at the same time accounting for the transformative powers as a site of transits. And it's a way also to circumvent, avoid, get around disciplinary isolations that I see in our respective disciplines and the incentive structures or lack thereof within Asian studies and Asian American studies. So I'm really trying to stitch together these two bodies of discourse that often kind of talk past each other and don't really engage with each other in a structured way. And I think that it's to their benefit because Asian American studies really could benefit from Asian studies theories on minority discourse, theories of imperialization, imperial formation. And at the same time, I think Asian studies could really benefit from, and this is Japanese studies and Korean studies, could benefit from racial formation theory, right? And Asian American studies, social justice is really the kind of engine that drives forward a lot of theorization that's based on conduits such as the labor law, culture as sort of these infrastructures for racial formation, but not so much on colonial modernity, or it's very kind of light on that. But in Asian studies, the reverse is also true. That's more focused on colonial modernity, not so much on contemporary labor practices, immigration, social justice, and law. I mean, these are broad, really broad generalizations, but that's sort of my reading of it. So today, what I would like to do is go through a couple of case studies I offer in the book, three major ones, and I'm going to discuss Kaneshiro Kazuki's Go as a way for me to discuss how important American racial discourse is to that novel. In discussing Chang-rae Lee's Adjust Your Life, I bring that into the discussion because I really think it's important to understand colonial modernity, or the discourse around colonial modernity, to understand that novel. And in the discussion of Pachinko, Min Jin Lee's Pachinko and Kim Masumi's Mosoka, I point out there's a kind of missing framework for that kind of inter-minority dialogue that those two novels are engaged in. So in my study of Go, I'm trying to really stress how integral American racial discourse is to the novel's meditation on the Zainichi racialization. So I'm framing my discussion of Go through something I'm calling Transpacific cultural mediation. And it's a view of minor literary traditions forming these kind of contact zones that, again, both bypass and negotiates the center. And then culture is the primary means by which this process, this procedure occurs in Go. So I'm sure most of you are already familiar with the novel and the film, but just in case you haven't come across it, Go is a novel about a second generation Zainichi high school student. His name is Sugihara, and he's struggling to find his place in Japan. And on, just on one level, it's a very straightforward genre piece. The chronicle of a high school, brawler, macho kid, and his romancing of a young woman. And Sugihara falls in love with a Japanese student named Sakurai, who doesn't realize that he's Zainichi. And the problem is that Sugihara presents as Japanese, so he has to decide consciously to reveal himself to Sakurai and reveal his ethnicity to Sakurai. But in the meantime, there's a subplot where his father changed nationalities from North Korean to South Korean, and this kind of sends Sugihara down this existential spiral because he doesn't really know what is what anymore. National identity, ethnic identity becomes much more fluid. And so Sugihara, in response, decides to quit going to a North Korean state school, goes to a Japanese school where he has to contend with a lot of fistfights and bullying. And then returning to his dilemma with Sakurai, it's only before they consummate their relationship that he decides to admit to her that he's actually Zainichi. And she initially rejects him. And then the novel ends with their reconciliation, right? When she finally accepts him for who he is. So I noted that in the novel, culture, particularly American cultural imports, are the main conduit through which Sugihara tries to reimagine his Zainichi selfhood. And the question is, well, why is culture important? And Lisa Lowe, in her book, Immigrant Acts, she argues that while it's the state that produces one definition of race through legislation and immigration policies, it's actually through culture that Asian Americans can challenge those definitions. And I think that Sugihara and Kaneshiro are doing something similar here, right? That they are using culture through the little cultural artifact of the book, but also within the novel cultural imports to redefine what Zainichi means, right? To travel through these cultural imports to negotiate meaning, right? So Sugihara, he's a second generation Zainichi whose relationship to the homeland is largely imaginative and in flux, right? And so it makes sense that in lieu of legislative and political mobilization, he's instead drawn to the cultural model and means. And you see this throughout the novel where some of the other Zainichi characters are much more militant or a bit more politically savvy. And so is not attracted to those means at all. He gravitates to culture time and again. So it's through American popular culture and American racial discourse in particular that he's able to begin to kind of negotiate between this ontological either or binary, right? So you have to kind of detour through this third cultural space to find a latitude to question those epistemologies, right? So I'm going to skip whole sections of my chapter's argument here, but what I want to stress as important to know is that initially he really flails. He fails trying this or that tactic, and ultimately ends up rejecting nationality and ethnicity as these sort of racial anchors. So instead, these have become these frustrating dead ends, because Zainichi, he comes to realize later, has become a racial category, something that he's really struggling to grasp because the language about racialization isn't really there yet. Right, so he stumbles upon race, where that's like the site of much of his intellectual and emotional labor. And yeah, I don't want to give the impression that references to American cultural products or American culture is unusual in Japanese fiction. I mean, it's quite common, right? But in Go, they emerge as really conspicuous in their functionality, right? As a means of contesting Zainichi positionality, right? So for example, and this is in the handout, Sugihara ruminates on the life and times of Jimi Hendrix as a kind of aspirational hybridity. And he talks about how Hendrix is able to play the national anthem as a means of protest, but also kind of make it his own and redefine what that song means to the African Americans, right? And he goes on to kind of wonder why is there kind of anything analogous in Zainichi culture, right? Like African American culture has produced jazz and hip hop, but nothing hasn't been analogous has been produced in Zainichi culture. And he goes on to like talk about his favorite American films, like the Godfather series, where there's this kind of iconic scene where one of the main characters comes to Ellis Island, gazes upon the Statue of Liberty as sort of this idealistic moment of migration. So in each case, Sugihara uses these imports as a frame for understanding himself as Zainichi. He's constantly questioning and comparing the two, right? And he's wrestling with the means of constructing not a South Korean, not a North Korean or a pan-Korean racial ontology, but a Zainichi culture, right? What critics have come to term the third way. And then, there are limits to how far this kind of mode can travel, right? It's more of a means than a permanent solution, right? So there are moments where, and this is what becomes problematic about Sugihara's method, where he kind of accepts the American hegemonic force, right, as sort of in the sort of the global world order. So he ventriloquizes Raymond Chandler and Philip Marlowe, Dashiell Hammett, the Continental Op, right? Even the U.S. military as a means of trying to carve out space for himself as Zainichi, but these prove to be really unsatisfying because they just beget the cycle of violence, right? So he encounters a number. He ultimately kind of discards his means, and he encounters another Zainichi character by the end of the novel, that presents another mode of achieving the third way. And so this character outs himself to Sugihara as a fellow Zainichi. His name's Miyamoto, and he articulates a similar awareness of American racial discourse, but particularly he's really interested in Korean American subjectivity. And they have this conversation, and Sugihara he tries to recruit Sugihara to this kind of Zainichi group, recruiting a unified Zainichi group, and creating a Zainichi identity endemic to the lives of Japan. And they come to an understanding where they're not exactly aligned in their project, but they respect each other in terms of their understanding they're coming to the same goal, but by different means, right? So the reason I bring up Go, and this is a sort of a short, brief overview of my chapter on Go, and I'm trying to show how it's engaging in this kind of inter-minority, transnational, trans-Pacific cultural dialogue as a means of kind of rehabilitating a fragmented history, a generational alienation between Sugihara and his father, and a stark kind of political absence, right? And American racial discourse is crucial to the novel's travels and negotiation, right? And so by framing my reading of the novel through theories of racial formation in the American context, I'm being very careful not to blithely project a wholly American context to the Zainichi novel. They wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, but it's my way of understanding exactly what Sugihara is trying to do and take his consumption of those artifacts on his terms, right? So if the conduit of my first case study is culture, the second conduit in Chang Rui Li's gesture life would be trauma. And the reason I bring up a gesture life is I think it would be particularly useful for this audience because this is a novel, an Asian American novel written by a Korean American author. It's quite popular, who's quite popular in the US and particularly amongst Asian American studies. I'm not quite sure how he's received in Japan. I know his novels have been translated into Korean, so he has a presence there. But I think this is a good case study to bring up here because I think once I contextualize my reading of A Gesture Life, I think it might be of more interest to Zainichi studies scholars in Japan, right? So if you're not familiar with Gesture Life, it's a novel that is significant because it was one of the first Korean American novels that centered around the story of the comfort women, right, or Yeonfu. But the novel has these, thank you, two parallel narratives. And the first centers on Lieutenant Kurahata of the Japanese Imperial Army, a medical officer who's ethnic Korean, Zainichi. And the second parallel narrative takes place in the present in New Jersey, in America, with Kurahata having changed his name to Doc Hata, and he's a proprietor of medical supplies. And both narratives are defined by his relationship to Korean women. The first case, in the military base in Singapore, and he is obsessed with this comfort woman named Kay. And in the second narrative, he has this equally unsettling relationship with his adopted daughter, Sunny, who is an orphan from Korea. Now, if you look at the literature, most of the scholarship in Asian American studies on Lee's novel really kind of gravitate to the second narrative about Hata's life in the United States and his estranged relationship with Sunny. And the relationship with Sunny is usually discussed in terms of like transracial adoption, politics, and racial miscegenation and theories thereof, right? But there's not as much recognition of how the protagonist is a Zainichi, right? That whole body of discourse kind of goes ignored or isn't really acknowledged. And the provocation I'm trying to put forward here is that not just in this novel, but Korean American literature in general should be considered post-colonial literature with respect to the Japanese Empire, right? And I'm going to argue that Hata's entire existence in the US is marked by Japanese colonialism, right? In fact, it's the Japanese colonial practices, racial practices, I should say, they follow him from across the Pacific to the United States, right? And to understand how that comes to be, we have to really first understand the system under which he was raised, right? Again, and forgive me if I'm just belaboring the point or going over material that you are already well familiar with, but this is new to an Asian American Studies uh, uh, scholarship, right? So Doka and Kominka, these two systems, assimilation and imperialization, was used by colonial Japan to convince its colonies to become that they could become Japanese through these processes, right? And the required promise of citizenship and its privileges was dangled in front of the colonized, but of course, there was really no intention to granting them full powers of citizenship, right? And Takafujitani in his book, Race for Empire, talks about this at length. Liu Qing in Turning Japanese talks about this at length. And I'm really trying to draw upon their work and building upon their articulations. And the main problem with Doka was that it was inherently paradoxical. That Japan's imperial mission was predicated on this idea of the uniqueness of the Japanese essence. So there's no room for that ideology for the other to participate in that uniqueness. And so even as Doka operates as this instrument of assimilation, it creates also at the same time the basis of discrimination against the other. So to overcome that contradiction, Doka constructed what's called an ambivalent relationship, right, between the colonial subject and object, right? So there's a kind of blurring of the lines, right? But that kept the other close, but the Japanese center was always separate and consistently in central, right? What some scholars point out is that Doka was somewhat analogous to the Yoshi adoption system in Japan, where you can conceptualize this relationship by understanding how, unlike patrilineal adoption systems like Korea or China or the United States, the Japanese system of adoption is tied to the family name or the household, right? So we can think of the colonized other as sort of the adopted to the colonial center, but they serve to exist in service to the house of Japan, right? And the house of the family, right? So, Hata's own relationship is similarly marked by that kind of ambivalence and contradiction, right? So he was adopted by the Kurohata family, and it appears that the Kurohatas were generous and particularly progressive, but he also notes that there's always a kind of distance between himself and his adopted family. And I draw your attention to this quote here on page 72 of Gesture Life, where he describes it that he thought of his adopted family as being in warm terms, but he says that they were an extension of the purposeful society, and the italics, the emphasis are my own here, that it was this broader institution that was responsible for his adoption into the family, right? And despite his being adopted and leaving his Korean identity behind, the assimilation is still always going to be incomplete, right? These, both adoption, both Doka and adoption are always going to be inadequate for true integration, right? So Kominka offers a possible alternative, or perhaps a more regimented, institutionalized, systematic means of integration, right? So he does that by joining the army, taking on the Japanese name, entering Japanese schools, and it's appealing because it grants order, logic, coherence that maybe has eluded him in the past, but something that he still finds to be lacking, right? And so after the war and post-liberation, the impetus for Doka and Kominka, they disappear, right? So he could return to being Korean, but Hata doesn't do that. He goes to America and continues to live as Japanese. In the second narrative in New Jersey, there's nothing stopping from Hata turning back to his Korean ethnic identity and to reclaim his Korean name, but he doesn't do that. In America, he performs this kind of doubled assimilationist project where he becomes more Japanese than he ever was in Japan, right? He's more successful as a colonized subject in America than he ever was in Japan, right? And so what I'm pointing out is that he is trying to uh, perpetuate that logic, that colonial logic in the United States, right? Um, but it's not just that's not what just happens, right? When he migrates to the United States, he finds himself coming headlong into another racialization project, right? But for which there's no real systematic solution like there was in Japan, right? Um, like he, Hata in the United States, he has imported a very specific colonial logic to a very different political and ethnic context. Um, and he's now encountering a very different national project that's particular to American history. And the crux of the tension of the novel is that Hata is trying to this kind of hybrid program of Kominka and American racial minoritization, right, to become the paragon Japanese model minority, right? And the fatal flaw is that he just ends up replicating the racist practices of colonization through adoption and recruiting his daughter for that same sort of pan-Asian American prosperity campaign, right? So you see like how just as Japan had adopted Korea, he's doing the same thing to his daughter Sunny, right? And the point I'm trying to make is that, again, I'm skipping over whole swaths of the argument here just to kind of give you an overview. But the point I want to stress here is that Japanese colonialism doesn't remain behind in Korea. It continues to haunt Korean America. But a lot of Asian American scholars don't really recognize that, or really are blinded to this whole other dimension of Korean American literature, right? Because a lot of post-colonialist theorists point out that a decolonization, a post-colonial condition, does not mean that the colonized site returns to a pristine pre-colonial state, right? Part of the anxiety of post-coloniality is that recognition that language, institutions, people, culture are forever changed. And to ignore that in the American immigration context, Asian American immigration context, creates a kind of one-dimensional view of Asian American literature. We need to integrate theories of colonial modernity to fully comprehend the gesture life and by extension, Korean American literature. So I've talked about two books, or two case studies that shows how ignoring critical discourse from either side, Asian studies or Asian American studies, results in this kind of one-dimensional picture, incomplete. In this last case study, I show how it crystallizes the disciplinary corners that we have kind of pinned ourselves to, and how Zainichi and Korean American authors are really kind of demanding a critical reckoning from scholars in both fields. So I believe Pachinko was translated into Japanese fairly recently. Is that right? Am I wrong? Anybody know? Right. Okay. Yes. Great. So Minjin Lee published Pachinko in 2017, and in the American sort of authorial sphere, it won a lot of mainstream acclaim. And it's unique because, or it's interesting because it's the first explicit literary example of Asian American culture engaging with Zainichi stories, right? But it creates this kind of problem for us, right? It presents a quandary for both Asian studies and Asian American studies, right? Because which discipline does Pachinko belong to? The subject matter, after all, you could argue it belongs to Japanese studies, maybe Korean studies. But the novel's written entirely in English by a Korean American author who, from my understanding, is not fluent in Japanese. And her first book belongs totally to Asian American studies, Free Food for Millionaires. So there's not a real, it doesn't neatly conform to our predisposed categories for our sort of disciplinary spheres, right? And the novel itself isn't restricted by national boundaries, right? It explicitly introduces characters and ideas from Asian America to Zainichi Korea. Similarly, Kim Masumi's Morosoka is set against the backdrop of a distinctly American site of national trauma during the 1992 Los Angeles riots, but is written in Japanese by a Zainichi Korean author, writing about a very distinctly Korean American moment and American moment, right? And that novella centers on this relationship between Zainichi and her Korean American friends, but the framing is entirely Zainichi, right? It's written all in Japanese, right? So, for Asian American scholars, Morosoka wouldn't really register just based on the language barrier alone, right? And these encounters are, as in the disciplines as they stand, are illegible, right, in the current structure, or they're written solipsistically, right? They're written past each other. And the point I'm trying to make is that this evidence, clear evidence of a Transpacific intertextual dialogue going on here, right? Going back many years, because Morosoka was written 20 years ago. And it's only now that the discipline begins to kind of widen its inquiry, and we're able to kind of finally detect them, right? I'm not going to talk too much about Morosoka in this talk. I can talk about it more during the Q&A, just because we're pressed for time. The way that I'm presenting a solution is to frame them as minor literatures mediated through the US and Japan, what I'm calling a diasporic minority transposition. And I argue that they're operating in similar ways, both Pachinko and Morosoka, right? First, the novels are written in their adopted languages for a domestic readership with a dual purpose, right? They're written for, Pachinko is not written for a Japanese audience. Pachinko is written for an American audience, right? Morosoka likewise is not written for an American audience, it's written for a Japanese audience or a Zainichi audience, right? And the reason is that they're interested in introducing a foreign body of racial discourse to a domestic readership, I should say, and to occupy that space as a means of reconceptualizing or negotiating the domestic minoritization or racialization, right? Second, they are explicitly involving representations of homeland minority discourse, right? So in Pachinko, for example, that involves a Korean American character who's thrust into the Zainichi sphere, much to her bewilderment. And in Morosoka, that involves a Zainichi protagonist who has to navigate a very alien racial climate, something that's very unfamiliar and unsettling, right? Defamiliarizing. And then finally, both novels, they decenter the dominant structures of power, right? And shove them into the background. So they taken together, they signal, as Shimeshur and Francois Linnet point out in this quote here, a recognition of the creative interventions that networks of minoritized cultures produce within and across national boundaries. And this is from their book, Minor Transnationalisms. So if you're, so that's too far. If you're not already, again, I'll give you a brief summary of Pachinko if you haven't already read it. It's this kind of sprawling Dickensian novel, and it follows 3 generations of Zainichi Koreans beginning in Jeju Island, Jeju-do, and ending in modern Tokyo with an offstage detour through America and New York City. And this novel begins with Sunja, this young woman who encounters 2 young Korean men who are both inflected by Western modernity in some ways, a young Christian minister named Baek Ishak, and a glamorous gangster named Ko Han-soo. And that eventually their encounters lead her to bearing 2 sons, the brash Moses, and the intellectual Noah. And they both end up in the shameful, extra-legal pachinko gambling industry. And it's Moses' son, Solomon, Sunja's grandson, who takes over the family pachinko business and breaks the cycle of shame and tragedy. And the novel is interesting in that, and the reading I want to provide here today is, and it's, again, I'm going to skip over quite a bit, but the sections I want to introduce here is how Lee, the novel, the author, is really interested in bringing forward a kind of comparative framework for negotiating Zainichi-ness, right? And she's doing this kind of in an interesting way. As a possible solution to Japanese discrimination, she presents Western modernity, right, but not white Western modernity, right? And the U.S. comes to embodies kind of fantasy land for a lot of the characters who want to escape discrimination from Japan. And you can see in this quote here, when Solomon is discussing moving to America with his wife Yumi, she, has this kind of idealized vision of what America is like, right? And she becomes fixated with it as sort of an alterity beyond the Ikaino ghetto, right? But Noah and Yumi's aspirations are tragically cut short. I won't spoil the book for you. But Noah, Mozasu and Solomon pick up where they left off. The second half of their transition begins with Solomon's education, which takes place entirely in English, and this is by design. He speaks Japanese at home, goes to school in English, and a smattering of Korean with his grandmother, right? And Mozasu has selected international schools for Solomon because he also has become fixated on this idea of Western modernity as a means of circumventing discrimination or latching onto the social capital of the West, right? So, Solomon ends up going abroad to New York City to study at Columbia University, and the legitimation project would appear to be nearly complete, right? He masters English, he lives in New York, he works in the finance industry, he has a long-term relationship with a Korean American woman named Phoebe. But he still faces a lot of familiar barriers when he returns to Tokyo. So, for example, upon returning, he needs a rented apartment, and he still needs a guarantor on his lease because he's still, a foreigner. And so, even the social capital, cultural capital of working for an American company is not enough to kind of overcome the infrastructural barriers that he still faces. And even further still, to kind of undergird and cement this point, he gets fired from his job because there was a business deal that went through that had the air of illicitness because some Zainichi business associates were associated with it, and the company got skittish and wanted nothing to do with them because they think all Zainichi are criminals, right? So Solomon walks away, understanding that he can't really escape racialization, right? As Zainichi or through American capital, he's still ruled by the local constructs of race. Now, I alluded to the fact that the novel consciously avoids appealing to white Western modernity, and it's symptomatic of this kind of decentering imperative in both Pachinko and Morosoka. But it does detour through Korean America, which might mean the perfect amalgamation of Western modernity, social capital, cultural capital, and citizenship, right? And that is largely in the form of Solomon's girlfriend, Phoebe, who he meets in college. And initially, he's really drawn to her. He's intoxicated by her confidence and just her sense of assuredness. And he convinces her to come with him to Tokyo when his firm transfers him. But her integration into Solomon's life is really kind of stunted, one-sided. And while Phoebe might intellectually understand Solomon's family history and his positionality, the relative positionality of Zainichi-ness, it doesn't really assuage her misgivings about Japan, right? Sorry, I went back the wrong way. Oh, here we go. So, from her perspective, Solomon's conditional residency is really offensive. Her understanding of her lineage and citizenship has never been in question simply by an accident of being born in the United States, right? It's when she's faced with other kind of paradigms as Korean American, she reacts violently and with outrage, right? And she's kind of this insular Korean American who refuses to empathize and transpose herself through Zainichi eyes, right? And ultimately they end up going their separate ways. And because her history is incongruous with Solomon's own, right? So instead, he doesn't go that way. He doesn't marry the Korean American. He finds a different path, right? He discovers a third way beyond the Korea-Japan binary and the United States back road, right? So he decides to stay in the pachinko business, reversing decades of shame to forge his own path, right? And the reason I'm bringing this dimension of the reading to this talk is that I want to point out how you know Lee's interest in the Zainichi was always comparatively oriented, and she was fascinated by the racialization of Koreans in U.S. and Japanese context, right? So in interviews, she confesses that she was previously, completely did not have any idea about the Zainichi, and it was only in college that she learned about their situation, and she was always fascinated by the comparative racializations and the comparative history, the different histories, and it contrasted with her own position as a daughter of a conventional merchant class immigrant family. She was at Columbia. She's at this elite university, and that was at odds with the whole kind of subset of ethnic Koreans in Japan who were relegated to the underclass. So you can read Solomon's decision to return to the pachinko business, kind of tacit critique that the Korean model maybe is not the viable solution for the Zainichi. And Solomon's decision could be his coming to terms with the unique situatedness of Zainichi, but I think maybe it's a little bit of both, right? Lee's novel is about the Zainichi, but it's also projection and extension and a negotiation and debate with Korean America. And I think Kim Musumi's Motosoka does something similarly, right? So I talked to a scholar at in Korea who she's at Sogang Taekyo, I think, and she had read Pachinko, and she really did not like it very much. Because to her, Pachinko didn't actually add anything new, and in some ways that's kind of true, because a lot of the subjects that Lee's novel dwells upon has been covered many times over by other Zainichi writers writing in Japanese, right? But the thing that I think the value that Pachinko adds is, again, that even though on the face of it, it might look like this kind of ventriloquization of Zainichi-ness, it's really about, it's also a kind of comparative framework of Zainichi and Korean America. And that's what I think is emblematic of the discussions that she's engaging with, Kim Masumi's engaged with, and my book, I think, is trying to unpack and uncover. So in each case, I've taken this kind of text to provide a reading drawing from another field's critical scholarship to show how that can benefit both fields, and to make the case for a kind of theoretical framework that effectively places the two sites in conversation with each other without conforming them or bending them to the gravitational pull of the colonial center. So I'll just stop there, and then I'd be happy to expand upon any points during the Q&A.